Hey there, students. Tom Richey here with the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are here for the last of our AP Prep webinars, but don't be alarmed because we are going to be back very, very soon. Okay, so we're going to take a week off, and then we're going to be getting back into the, really into an almost nightly APUSH review. So let me go ahead and share my screen here for a moment because there's something I want to show you as far as what we've got coming up. Now, first of all, if you are, in AP government, then you will it's now y'all are in APUSH more than likely, but for your friends that are in AP government, we've got some AP Gov prep webinars right now. Okay, so we've got some AP Gov prep webinars going on, and those are going to start on Wednesday, April the 29th. Okay, so we're going to see on Wednesday, April the 29th, and you will have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday through May 2nd. And, then we've got, going back on Sunday, May 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, and 7th. Okay. Now, of course, AP government is going to be one of the first exams that's given there. And then we will be coming back the week of May 4th. Okay. So we're going to be coming back Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. And we'll go ahead and start off on colonial America. Okay. So as far as that goes, we're going to be starting off on colonial America, and then we'll go from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then we will be back on Sunday, May 10th, and we'll go all the way through Thursday, May 14th. Okay, so we'll have that going on, and we will, we'll be there basically nightly. So the week of May the 4th, Monday through Thursday, then we're going to come back Sunday through Thursday. So just keep that in mind, still at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. Now, Paul Sargent with the AP government reviews, that's going to be 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern. Okay, so with your AP Gov friends, make sure to tell them to listen in on the Bill of Rights Institute. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, what I have in mind for us to do this evening, now, of course, there's been some speculation. Okay, now none of this speculation has actually come from the College Board, but there's been speculation what might happen as far as might we see some type of thematic DBQ or something like that. So it's good, even if the DBQ is not expressly thematic, we're going to be seeing possibly some themes, and I think that these things are useful no matter what era. Okay, so no matter what era, things would be, this would be useful. So what we're going to do is an immigration and internal migrations review. Okay, so we're going to go ahead, and I've got a Google document that I'm going to go ahead and be working from here, and then we can take some questions. And of course, since we're done with the AP Prep series, if we've got a little time at the end, I can open this up for some general Q&A. And so as far as that, if we're thinking about internal migration, certainly, James, kind of an overall theme here. You wanted to ask, can we discuss Frederick Jackson Turner? Okay, the Turner Thesis. All right, so when we're talking about the Turner Thesis, I think that that's certainly important for us to understand that Frederick Jackson Turner wrote an essay called "The Importance of the Frontier in American History." Now, he presented this, see, the Columbian Exposition, the 1893 Columbian Exposition. This is something that we hear about it because of, well, it's 400 years after Columbus. Remember that we're showing off light bulbs. I mean, this is basically America has arrived. Like the Columbian Exposition, you would have the Crystal Palace in London in 1850. In the 1880s, of course, the Eiffel Tower. Okay, so the Eiffel Tower is built, and everybody from all over the world gets to go to Paris and see the Eiffel Tower. And so then the United United States is like, check this out. Okay, we've got this electric light. And so this Columbian Exposition in Chicago, it's like 30 years before this in 1863, Americans were a bunch of farmers killing each other. And now in 1893, the United States is showing itself off as the greatest industrial power in the world, and we have invented electricity. Now, all kinds of other stuff is going on here. And there is Frederick Jackson Turner, who is presenting his paper and on the significance of the frontier in American history. And something that is very, very important that, James, you're highlighting here is why this was relevant in 1893 is that in 1890, it was the first US census that was ever given that said there's not a frontier. Okay, so if we look at, US frontier line by decade, I wonder if we can see this, if we've got something following the frontier line 1790 to 1890. So let's go ahead and just take a look here. This is actually on the United States Census. Yeah, let me go ahead and put that up because this is a public domain. American taxpayers own this, so we can go in and we can share this. So here is 1790, the first census. Okay, then we go to 1800. 1810, 1820. Now, as far as this goes, people per square mile. Now, note this, 200 or 2,000 people per square mile. We're not quite there yet anywhere. What we want to understand when we're thinking about America in 1790, 95%, 19 out of 20 Americans lived in rural areas. Now, by 1920, the majority of people live in urban areas. And now about 3/4 of Americans live in urban areas. And so 1800, this is Jefferson's America, 1800 and 1810. Now we start to see some Americans going west. We see Louisiana's becoming kind of populated here. At the time of the Civil War, this is what things are looking like here. Now they're not showing us where the frontier line actually is, but by 1890, okay, you see here where, this is 1850. And then this is 1890, okay, that Americans are crossing the Mississippi. We see pockets of settlement here in Colorado and Utah, and certainly a lot of people here in the Bay Area. Shout out to anybody watching from the Bay Area right now. And so in 1890, what we see here is that the United States Census Bureau says that we're no longer going to have a frontier line, okay? So there's not we're not going to know the presence of a frontier line in this year's census. And I can't find where they're drawing the lines, but you can kind of get what's going on here. Okay, some of y'all may have played Oregon Trail growing up. I played like the OG Oregon Trail with the discs that were like really like truly floppy. It's a long time ago. Okay, so with that, Frederick Jackson Turner is wondering, what are things going to be like now? Because Turner said that the frontier had really defined America, because when you look back at colonial America, when people had just gotten here, that America was basically like a suburb of Europe. But as the United States moved west, it became more American. There was always somewhere for Americans to go who are looking for a new life, who are looking for adventure, who are looking for free land. There was always something. And Frederick Jackson Turner says, now that there's not a frontier, what's going to happen? And this is kind of interesting, given that 1890 is where we start to see the progressive era. Okay, so the progressive era is typically defined about 1890 to 1920, and we start to see that the United States certainly in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, as far as the whole idea of like rugged individualism, which used to define Americans, it's interesting to see how things have changed. And that's something, when you think about that, westward expansion is the greatest internal migration that we've ever seen. It's just this constant flow of Americans moving west. And remember, how can we ever forget American progress. Okay, so when we look at this painting, American Progress. Okay, so we've got the Center for American Progress. That's not what I'm looking for. Yes, I'm looking for the painting. Okay, of course, as you see this, which we always associate this painting with manifest destiny. Okay, so that's something that is definitely a significant theme in American history. And so, as far as that goes, yeah, so we're going now. One thing, James, if you haven't seen it already, that there is my video on Thomas Jefferson versus Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, Thomas Jefferson versus Teddy Roosevelt. And with that, when we're looking at that video, you can kind of see that transition. But what I want to focus on in particular is looking at specific internal migrations. Okay, specific internal migrations and specific, immigration waves. All right, which of course we've seen this week that President Trump has actually, signed an order halting immigration, even though I think that's with an asterisk. I think that the executive order, as it is now, is relatively innocuous. But I know that it's been greeted with some people saying it's un-American to halt immigration. But then again, it's happened a lot of times in the nation's history, and certainly when we look back at the history of the United States, when there are large waves of immigration, native populations have not always been happy to see these new folks. And so with that, let's go ahead and just take a quick look here at the immigration history of the United States. So let me go ahead and expand this. Now, of course, the link is, I believe, in the description. Okay, should be in the video description. But as far as that goes, we want to take a look at what's going on here. Who was here, when did they come, and when? Okay, so when did they come, and from where? And so with that, we want to note colonial and early national America. So the immigration history of the United States is pretty straightforward when we're looking at the colonial and the early national period. These are people coming from Northern and Western Europe. So that's important to think about. These are my ancestors. My ancestors came from England and Scotland before the 1840s. And so, these are folks coming from England, Scotland, Germany, and Scandinavia. These are where a lot of these immigrants were coming from. And note that these immigrants were overwhelmingly Protestant. Okay, so these immigrants were overwhelmingly Protestant. And so with that, that is what you start to see in the antebellum period. The first real exception here in the antebellum period in the 1840s and 1850s. You want to note the influx of Irish immigration, okay? Irish immigration or German immigration to a lesser extent here. Now, one thing that we want to note about German immigration, I think I may have, I'm not sure, I've got an asterisk by there, and I'm not sure where that asterisk goes, but I can kind of tell you what I was probably thinking when I put that there. That German immigration, one thing we want to think about here is we want to consider. Just one second, need to tell somebody how to get here. All right. So with that, German immigration. Now, a lot of you have German ancestry, and actually, when people are asked about their ancestry, more Americans say German than anything else. Now, if you were to put together English and Scottish, that would actually be more than German. So people who would say English and Scottish. Now, also what's kind of funny is people here in the South that talk like me. There are a lot of people white Southerners, when they're asked about their ancestry, have a habit of saying American, not really knowing where they're from, but their ancestry, a lot of them are coming from, England and Scotland. So England and Scotland together would be more than Germany, but more Americans, more spread out across the country. Now, especially in the Midwest, a lot of German settlers settled in the Midwest, and German immigration is actually something that is, kind of a constant stream. Okay, there are plenty of Germans coming in, not necessarily in just one wave. So it is important to kind of note here that German immigration is coming in. Now, also, like I said, in the Midwest. Now, German before World War I, German was typically the most commonly taught the most commonly taught foreign language in schools. Now, after World War I, of course, during and after World War I, we see that the teaching of German in schools is something that becomes almost non-existent because Germany is seen as the enemy. And so before that, though, German was the most taught language. So when you think about like what Spanish is today in American schools, used to be German. So what we want to note about this antebellum wave of immigration is it's the first wave of Catholic immigration. Now, today, Catholics make up over a quarter of the country. Okay, so 1 in 4 Americans is Catholic, but that was not the case before the wave of Irish immigration. Catholics may have made up about 5% of the population before 1840. That, you know, today the United States is about 70% Christian, but imagine a United States that is about 90% Protestant. And that's what you're looking at in the 1840s. So when you look at the Irish, there are two things here. You see the religious aspect, but also, you know, not just the Catholic religion, but also the willingness to work for cheap. Okay. And so there was a resentment among Native American laborers. Now, when I say Native American, I'm using the language of the Know Nothing Party. So if you would go back to the 1850s and you said Native American, okay, what you're going to be heard as saying is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, is Native American, whereas these Irish immigrants were seen as you know, as not part of the country. And so the Know Nothing Party, okay, that got about 20% of the vote in the 1856 election. And this was an election where the Know Nothing Party, the chief issues here were against Catholics and immigration. Okay, so you see really the first like politicized anti-Catholic movement in the United States. So from there, let's see, it looks like we may have a question coming in here. All right. Yes, exactly, Addie. And I'm getting to that whole divide between old and new immigration. Okay, so when I'm talking about this here, when we're thinking about old and new immigration, then what we're thinking here is old immigration. Okay, what we know is old immigration is Northern and Western Europe. Okay, I don't know if my hands are showing up correctly there, but Northern and Western Europe, that's what we're talking about when we talk about old immigration. Now, even today, okay, let's see, the most prior to world, they always had also, okay, so as far as that only in America, I'm not sure here. Not sure about your question there, James. Okay, so yeah, when we think about which old immigration, keep in mind that the Irish, given that they got here in the 1840s and 1850s, would be considered old immigration. Like when we think about this, like people today in the United States who have Irish ancestry, they're typically aware of it. But when you think about this, like nobody thinks of like somebody who's an Irish American may think of themselves as an Irish American, but nobody looks askance at them thinking like, they're an Irish American. Okay. I mean, they're, you know, they've been here for a long time. All right. So as far as that goes, going on with that, what we want to get into after that is the Gilded Age. Now, one thing that we'll notice is you've got the first wave of non-white immigration. Okay, so that's during the Gilded Age. You see Chinese immigration, partly because of the gold rush. Now, of course, the gold rush is not only, you know, a cause for immigration from Asia, but also this is an internal migration. So you want to note the Western trails during the antebellum period, with people going to Oregon to farm, to California to seek gold, strike it rich, and to Utah if they were part of the Mormon Exodus. And so Chinese workers who were here had a large role in building the Transcontinental Railroad. By 1880, they made up 10% of California's population. And there was a popular nativist outcry. So in the antebellum period, the popular nativist outcry was about Irish immigrants and immigrants coming in from Germany to a lesser extent. Now, the thing is that German immigrants tended to go settle in the Midwest and farm. The reason why you hear more about Irish immigrants and the Irish riots is because Irish immigrants tended to stay in cities. So, for example, when a nativist mob burned a Catholic church in Philadelphia in the 1840s, that is because a lot of Irish immigrants stayed in the cities. And so, when you go out into the rural areas and you farm, there's not going to be as much of a nativist response out there. So, as far as that goes, even with all of the anti-Irish sentiment, then the Know Nothing Party was organized, but there was nothing done to stop the Irish from entering the country, to legally bar the Irish from entering the country. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, this is the first time that there was a law that was passed about concerning, like, basically the first immigration restriction. Okay, so there's a restriction on immigration and specifically banning immigration from one country. Now, sorry about some of the scrolling. I just got a new mouse and it's kind of sensitive on the scrolling, and I'm not sure I need to figure out how to do that a little better. But with that, so the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, we want to note here that Japan is a westernizing country in the late 19th century, and Japan had diplomatic relations with the United States, and it actually bought its first ironclad ship from the United States as surplus. It was actually it was fascinating to me a couple months ago when I was reading online, and there was this Confederate ironclad ship called the Stonewall. It was originally the CSS Stonewall. And then, of course, after the Civil War, it was incorporated in the U.S. Navy. Then the U.S. Navy was done with it. The Japanese purchased it. And kind of ironically, the Japanese used it to put down a rebellion. So the Japanese had diplomatic relations with the United States, and the Japanese did not want immigration from Japan to be banned. They didn't want to be dishonored in that way. So there was in 1907 a gentleman's agreement where the Japanese just said that they were going to stop people from boarding ships that were bound to the United States. So the gentleman's agreement, because Japan decided to self-police, that was basically, there's no law, it's just an agreement. So that way, Japan was not excluded in the same way that China was. So again, you're seeing, a wave of immigration, a nativist response, and that seems to be a pattern throughout the history of the United States. And so then in the progressive era, now, so somebody asked me, are we going to get into the new immigrants? All right. So when we look at the new immigrants in Southern and Eastern Europe, so old immigration, we're talking about England, Scotland, Scandinavia, Germany, even Ireland. Okay, by this time, Irish people are becoming a little bit more established. So Northern and Western Europe. Of course, we're not talking about France, because France is, people don't tend to leave France. Every once in a while, I run into somebody in the United States with French ancestry, but not very often. Okay, so we don't see that. So as far as that goes, we are going to, now go into the new immigrants. Now, these are people from Italy, Poland, Greece, and Russia, etc. Okay, so they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, and so going from there, and we see here, why are these people not being welcomed? Why are they having a hard time fitting in? So note here that these immigrants from Italy, Poland, Greece, and Russia, they are not Protestant. Okay, first of all, they're not Protestant. They're not English speaking. They have no experience with Republican institutions. Now, note I'm saying small r Republicanism. So small r, not the Republican Party, that they tended to come from places that had monarchies. Okay, now this is also going to be something that when we think about Russia, then you have the communist revolution. And so going from there, we see that they have no experience in the Republican institutions. They tended to be uneducated and unskilled. So if you want to be like a welcome, a welcome immigrant, like people that come in and they don't, they're not resisted. These immigrants tend to be from Northern and Western Europe, tend to be English speaking, and then, educated, bringing in money. Now, of course, today, what we have to think about is, for throughout most of the history of the United States, like pre-World War II, most immigrants coming in are unskilled. Now, one thing as we go toward, now, of course, contemporary America is not going to be on the exam, so we don't have to give that a lot of time. But one thing to note here is ever since the 1960s, okay, there are a lot of things that happen in the 1960s. And what we see here is, we start to see a more inclusive, like global immigration policy. Also, we see here immigrants who possessed useful, skilled jobs, okay, or they already had relatives in the United States. Like today, a lot of immigrants that come into the United States are actually educated and skilled workers, which was, not the case in throughout most of the history of the United States. So going from there, we want to note that the new immigrants, we associate them with the progressive era. And one of the priorities for the progressive era, like the progressives, when we think about, they wanted a larger role for government, first of all, dealing with issues raised by urbanization, but also dealing with the issues that they saw raised by mass immigration. So when you look at someone like Jane Addams, okay, Jane Addams, who ran the Hull House. This is someone who, was operating this settlement house, basically allowing people to try to fit in. Okay, the settlement houses, they would provide job training. They would provide classes where immigrants can learn English. So let's say they go and they work their shift at the meatpacking plant there in Chicago, and then they can go to the settlement house and they can learn English. They could, this is basically giving them job and language skills, and also trying to get them away from political machines. That's one thing that happened. Like when you look at Jane Addams' work, this actually showed up on the DBQ last year, that the influence of political machines, that these immigrants come off of the boat, and then somebody's there to greet them. Let me get you an apartment in this ethnic neighborhood. Let me then help you to find a job. And then, because of all this nice stuff we've done for you, when it comes time to vote, we're going to tell you who to vote for. And that's where you see, like, the Tweed Ring in New York City, and some of these other political machines. So that's part of, Jane Addams and her work. She wanted to help immigrants, learn the skills that they needed in order to be able to mix in with general society and not be so dependent on these political machines. Now, also, we want to note that public education during the progressive era became more focused on citizenship. So when you see things like, the Pledge of Allegiance, that came from the progressive era, that had its origins in the progressive era. That was, so to say the Pledge of Allegiance, because part of the mission of public education is to acquaint people coming into the country with the American way of life. Now, during the progressive era, you have this massive wave of new immigration. Now, of course, again, you have an outcry against these immigrants. Now, another thing that we'll note here, and I don't know, did I mention? Let me go ahead and add that here. Let's see, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Okay, so this is the 1920s. All right, so let me go ahead and remember to do that. So first of all, after World War I, you've got the first Red Scare. Okay, so when we look at the context of the first Red Scare, and this is one of the big things here, is we want to be able to take any immigration movement and be able to put it into the context of a period of U.S. history. So we want to be able to pair up the new immigrants with the progressive era, the Irish immigrants with the antebellum period, okay? And so going from there, the first Red Scare, when we think about World War I in the 1920s, okay? So, this is, the Bolshevik Revolution has happened. So we hear like communism's not just an idea anymore. Communism's actually happened somewhere. Now we look back at that and we think like, oh my goodness, these people were panicking. Like communism could never happen in the United States. But think about this. People thought before the Bolshevik Revolution, communism can't happen in any country, like any powerful country. And all of a sudden, the Russian government has been brought down by this communist revolution. People could be looking back at this current coronavirus crisis and thinking they did what? I mean, who knows? It's going to be very interesting 30, 40 years from now to read the history of 2020. This is going to be something that's going to be very fascinating. So the first Red Scare, it's starting because a lot of Americans are afraid that these immigrants that have been coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, that they are going to start a communist revolution here. And that's where, of course, you had the Palmer raids, which resulted in, we want to note the Palmer raids resulted in the deportation of hundreds of radical, immigrants. Okay, so hundreds of, immigrants who were who held radical political views. Okay. Now, as far as that goes, remember the Palmer raids, are also, often seen as a denial of due process. Okay. So that's something that was, when we think about the first Red Scare, the context is the Bolshevik Revolution. One of the specific things that happened during the first Red Scare would be the Palmer raids. Now, nativism. Okay, so again, we have this nativist response. Okay, so you had this massive wave of, Catholic, Jewish, Eastern Orthodox immigration, non-Protestant coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the second Ku Klux Klan. Now note that the first Ku Klux Klan was a creature of radical Reconstruction. This was something that came up in the South. This was native white Southern resistance to radical Reconstruction. After radical Reconstruction was over, the first Ku Klux Klan was over. Well, there was this movie, Birth of a Nation, that came out in 1915. And Birth of a Nation was a movie about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it cast the Ku Klux Klan in a very heroic light, and also used stuff from a book that was written by then President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, who had actually been a professional historian. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson, who'd actually been a historian. Let me see, at least my mouse, this new mouse that I've got, when I drop it, it doesn't like spit out doesn't open up and spit out its batteries. So that's been an improvement. Okay, so as far as that goes, let me go ahead and find this again. Sorry about that. I can be kind of clumsy sometimes. And so going from there, we want to note that the Ku Klux Klan, now, of course, most people are familiar with the Ku Klux Klan's, racist agenda against blacks. But at the same time, when you look here, that in the 1920s, it was about, about immigrants as well. Okay, so when we think about this, we want to make sure that we're noting that. Now, one thing so I need to make a few notes about like internal migrations as well, okay, because we want to note here that not only is the second Ku Klux Klan, they're responding to nativism, they're responding to new immigration, but also we want to note the Great Migration. Okay, so the Great Migration of African Americans from the South. Okay, began during World War One. Okay, so basically World War One, as basically what's happening, you've got push and pull factors. The pull factor is during World War One, there were a lot of jobs that were opening up because of these young white men who were leaving to go and work, to go, or not to go and work, but to go to war. And so began during World War One. Okay, so as black men sought jobs in northern cities. Okay, so basically cities, and brought, and eventually brought their families with them. Okay, so as far as that goes, that we see here this great migration. Okay, so that most African Americans stayed in the South during and after Reconstruction. Okay, so we see here the Great Migration, and so what you see not only is the second Ku Klux Klan a response to immigration, but also a response to the Great Migration of African Americans, and so that's something that that we see happening during this time. And so with that, the Ku Klux Klan was trying to promote this very, waspy idea of America, that the United States is a nation of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and anyone who doesn't fit that mold is not 100% American. Now, at the same time, in the 1920s, we see, now remember we noted the Chinese Exclusion Act. In the 1920s, we see the passage of the Immigration Quota Acts, and those laid the foundation for the system of controlled immigration that we have today. Now, note here that there's nothing inherently wrong, with controlling immigration. Most of, I think nearly all Americans would say, okay, there needs to be some type of control of immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act was targeting immigrants from a specific country. Now, what we see here with the Immigration Quota Acts is, for one thing, we see that the United States is making the first attempt to have a system of immigration. Okay, that there is, like this many people come from this country, this many people come from this country. Now, one thing to note here, though, about the Immigration Quota Acts is that the quotas were determined by national origins and gave preference to people who came from Northern and Western Europe. They based the quotas on people who lived in the United States in 1890. Okay, so we see here that the quotas that were set up, so there were some things about this legislation that was specifically designed to have less immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and also from basically anywhere that was like not Northern and Western Europe. So the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Now, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, this is a very high profile murder trial, where Sacco and Vanzetti were the defendants. Okay, so, the Italian defendants were, were found guilty and executed based on evidence that was not fully conclusive. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but after looking at it, when you look at the evidence, you can look at it on the internet, and it's like, okay, they probably, at least one of them probably did it. But when we think about beyond a reasonable doubt, that standard was not really established. Okay, so based on so executed based on evidence, evidence that that was not conclusive. Okay, so evidence that was not fully conclusive. Okay, so as far as this goes, like I would say, I mean, if I were going to like bet money or something like that, 50-50 odds, I'd say, yeah, one of them likely did it. But at the same time, when we think about our standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, that if we're going to execute somebody, it needs to be beyond a reasonable doubt. So when we look here at this trial, it seemed like more, because Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants, they were anarchists and they were accused of a crime. And that just seemed like that's more than enough for a native born American jury. So that's something that is worth noting. It would be a good piece of specific evidence to use there. So again, contemporary America in the 1960s, we start to see that, origins quotas. Now this could be something that you could find worthwhile to use to kind of sprinkle in some complex understanding. So we start to see that in the 1960s, of course, this is the same time as the civil rights movement. Okay, this is the same time that we see we see some things going on, that Congress is passing laws that are banning discrimination, okay, within the country. And so we see here that now immigrants can come in from Asia. They can, they can come from Africa. They can come from the Middle East. And so the 1965 Act, again, that we start to see after the 1960s, we start to see skilled immigrants. So for example, if there's somebody who went to medical school in India or Romania, or not Ukrainian, but a Ukrainian trained chemist, these people can come into the United States under special visas for skilled workers. And of course, also immigrants that already have relatives in the United States can get priority. Now, the Immigration Act of 1990 lifted restrictions against homosexual immigrants, lifting prohibitions against what were called sexual deviants. If any of y'all have seen the movie Scarface, at the very beginning of that movie, they're asking him questions. They're asking him, does that, are you this? Are you this? Are you a communist? Are you a homosexual? Like that's something that would have been asked of people before the Immigration Act of 1990. So with that, I've gone through most of the basis for my presentation here in our review. So if there are any questions, dealing with immigration, internal migrations, we can go into that. So James, that's kind of clever with Woodrow Wilson at his PhD. Does that make him Dr. President? Okay. So as far as that goes, yeah, we can see, James, that's another thing that we see in the 1960s. We also see the trend of decolonization. Okay. So we see decolonization. And so we've got James. I tell you what, you are really owning the chat here. It looks like Eliza is here as well. Hello, Eliza. And aren't there multiple great migrations? Okay, so Michael, I don't know if I would get so much into saying that there were multiple. Certainly, we could say that migrations continued. Okay, so as far as that goes, we can say that is an ongoing process. So it's not as if the Great Migration just kind of stopped all of the sudden. So I would note for the APUSH exam that the Great Migration began during World War I, and then from there, I would say that it continued. I don't think you would necessarily need to get into like when was the second or third Great Migration. Kind of like, I think that, when you look at American religious history, there have technically been like 5 or 6 Great Awakenings in this country's history, but you only need to know 2. It's like the first and second Great Awakening are sufficient. And so as far as that, James, that is definitely an interesting proposition that you're saying there, that when you see the end of the American frontier line and the completion of Manifest Destiny, that did the whole world become our frontier? So that's definitely an interesting question there. And yes, Justin, I think we are going to see some of the things right now in the history books. One thing, now I'm not going to substantiate this. I haven't looked into it, but I was reading that there's a professor that has adjusted the coronavirus rate in spread rate in states after compensating for things like population density and urban, rural, and all of that. And there doesn't necessarily seem to be a difference in the rate of transmission in states that have had lockdowns versus states that haven't. Now that's going to be interesting to see how people look back at this. Now, while we are in the middle of this, most people seem to think the best thing to do is just to stay home and not work. But it's going to be very interesting once all the chips fall, everybody has the information, people have the benefit of hindsight. People are going to, historians are going to write about what's going on right now. And they're going to look at us a certain way. Either we handled this wisely or not wisely. The thing is, Ernie, or Aren, I'm sorry. So Aren, I think that political machines can definitely, really, here's the thing, that whatever is on the DBQ is going to be relevant. That's the thing about this exam, that the reason why we're looking at immigration and internal migrations in general is that odds are one of these things could be relevant depending on the prompt. Okay, so now if the prompt is about immigrants, then maybe there you go. Now, with the family from the jungle. Now, James, I will confess that I've never actually read The Jungle. I think I've read an excerpt from it, as far as that goes. But if you're thinking about the family from the jungle, would they be new immigrants from Lithuania? Lithuania is an Eastern European country. So yeah, so if we think about Central and Eastern Europe, that could be Lithuania, that could be Romania, that could be Russia or Ukraine, that could be any of those places there. It could be Greece. And so that when we're thinking about that, if they came from Lithuania, they would be considered new immigrants. These are people that came from Eastern Europe. So remember, any new immigrant, Southern or Eastern Europe, is where they're, is where they're coming from. So yes, as far as that goes, we've got, any last minute questions. I know I seem to be wrapping up a little bit early here, but I am, I am, let's see. So get it. All right. So yeah. All right. So again, y'all go ahead and ask me any questions y'all have. Remember, okay, excellent. Could they be influenced by, okay, so yeah. So as far as this goes, Syed, that yes, the Quota Acts were definitely, when you look at the Quota Acts of the 1920s, okay, that the goal of these Quota Acts in the 1920s was first of all to control immigration, which there's nothing inherently wrong with controlling immigration and having some type of organized system. The 1920s are actually also the time that the United States Border Patrol was commissioned, primarily to deal with the border of Canada during Prohibition. So we see here that the 1920s, this is the first time the United States is becoming conscious of its border and conscious of immigration and wanting to control the rate. But yes, definitely when we look at the Immigration Quota Acts, especially the National Origins Act, which said that we are going to give priority to people from nations in the quotas that they were here by 1890, it was definitely something that was seeking to lessen the amount of Catholic immigration, lessen the amount of immigration coming from Central and Eastern Europe, and to promote more immigration. Basically, the way that those acts were written, they guaranteed that people from Germany and Britain and Scandinavia could come in. Okay, that they had no trouble getting in. If you were from anywhere else, there was going to be a quota and you had to basically wait in line. So yes, definitely the Quota Acts were, this whole thing, one thing that we want to note here is that people who are Catholic, in this country today, a quarter of Americans are Catholic. In a lot of places, Catholics make up the majority or the near majority. Now in the American South, in the South where I live, not so much. Okay. But yeah, there's definitely, when you look at, now I'm not going to associate directly the Quota Acts with the Klan, but if you look at the Quota Acts, you look at the Ku Klux Klan, they're definitely, again, I'm not associating those two things, but there seems to be an effort from a lot of fronts to try to maintain the status of the United States as a Protestant country. That's something that did matter to a lot of people. And so why don't we limit immigrants from the Western Hemisphere? Could it be? Now, as far as that, the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so when we think about now, actually, James, I think that the Immigration Quota Acts could apply to immigrants from the Western Hemisphere. So I'm not certain how all of that works, to be quite frank with you, okay, as far as that goes. The Great Migration, you know what, that's fine, Versi, but yeah, I would just say that it begins with, it begins with World War One. But yeah, I think that we definitely could see that as going through 1970. Because the thing is, you don't necessarily see a lot of like mass. Oh, the other thing, oh, actually, you know what? I was about to say we need to remember the Sun Belt, but we don't need to remember the Sun Belt because the Sun Belt's not relevant because it's after World War II. But we want to note here that, after World War II, let's see, World War II, there was an internal, let's just go, since we've got a few minutes, we might as well, right? And then we'll see if there are any last minute questions, and we'll remind you to watch when we come back on May 4th. Okay. So as far as that stuff, let me just, let's see. The motives. Okay, now another thing here. So Dylan, let me get to that in just a second here. Okay, I'm going to address just to make sure there was an internal migration to the Sun Belt. Okay, so these are basically states, from the this is basically, ranging from the Carolinas to California. Okay, so this can include Florida, this can include Texas, migration of the Sun Belt because of, first of all, air conditioning. Okay, because of the massive availability of air conditioning. Because I tell you what, I love being from the South. I'm very proud to be from the South, Southern by the grace of God. But at the same time, without air conditioning, this place would be miserable in the summers. So the availability of air conditioning and, and corporations, basically, when you look at, manufacturing jobs are coming from the South, are coming into the South, and, cheaper and less regulated labor, supply, so basically when we think about individuals and of course, cheap labor, those things are happening after those things are happening after World War II. Okay, so Dylan is asking here about what are some other motives here. So one thing that we want to get into. It's okay, Emily, if you forgot it today, it's going to be available on the Bill of Rights Institute's YouTube channel. So as far as that now, okay, so Dylan, let me go ahead and take a look here. So Dylan, what were some other motives? One thing we want to note. So for example, let's think about this: the Chinese Exclusion Act. Why did that happen in the 1880s? The Chinese Exclusion Act happened in the 1880s because they're done building the transcontinental railroads. So notice that nobody was, even if people were complaining about Asian immigration, nobody was trying to stop it while a labor supply was needed for the railroads. Now, when you look at new immigration, so new immigration started in the 1890s. Why is it that legislation wasn't passed until the 1920s? So here's the thing. You've got in the midst of this, of the industrialization of America, that so many workers are needed. Okay, so when you start to think about this during the progressive era, the economy needed unskilled workers. Now you go to the 1920s and things are stabilizing. Okay, and of course you are seeing the advent of electricity and some other labor, labor's becoming more efficient, especially with Henry Ford's assembly line. And so there's a certain point when you think about the 1920s. Yeah, it's easy to think about like nativism, racism, and things like this, but there's also the very practical element that by the 1920s, the United States is thoroughly industrialized and they don't need that massive incoming labor supply. So there are definitely some economic motives for the Chinese Exclusion Act and for the Immigration Control Acts of the 1920s. So Dylan, that is an excellent question. Okay, so let's just take another look here, see if anybody is watching. Luke, I'm glad that you think this is a privilege. Okay, so as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, all of our AP Prep webinars will continue to be available on the Bill of Rights Institute's YouTube channel, and I want to remind y'all that we are going to be back. Now, we've been doing this every Tuesday and Thursday during some of the spring months, but we are going to be back with AP US History Prep webinars, okay? And that is going to start on May the 4th. So remember, Star Wars Day, May the 4th be with you. We are going to be back on Monday, May the 4th, okay? So we're going to be coming out on May the 4th, with colonial America going into the American Revolution, early national America, and then the Jeffersonian Republic. So we're going to basically go into a chronological review of US history, okay? And then we're going to take a couple days off. We're going to take Friday and Saturday off. We'll be back Sunday, May 10th, and we'll go Sunday through Thursday, and that's going to be at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. So that's going to be up to the evening before the exam. So Thursday, May 14th, that's going to be the night before the exam, and we will get into the Great Depression and World War II. Okay, so as far as that goes, now remember, my friend Paul Sargent will be on the Bill of Rights Institute's YouTube channel at 8 p.m. Eastern, starting on April 29th. Okay, so going from April 29th, Paul Sargent will be going through what you need for the AP government exam. So be sure to let your friends know that the Bill of Rights Institute will be here for them as well, not just for AP US history, but also for AP government. So as far as that goes, that would be yeah. So Teresa, that's one thing, we're never like, I'll never be comprehensive. There are always going to be some things that that's going to occur to me like, yeah, we need to make sure to include that. So yeah, Teresa, definitely if we think about the Indian Removal Act, that would be something to do with internal migration. My emphasis when I started making this is primarily on immigration. I've been adding some things on internal migrations. And I think that I do tend to kind of focus on some of the more voluntary internal migration, such as the Great Migration. But yes, definitely, just because I didn't mention an immigration wave or an internal migration doesn't mean that it didn't happen, doesn't mean that it's not important. So definitely, even though and that's the other thing, since this is a DBQ, test, we want to make sure the evidence is going to be yours to present. So whether I touched on it or not, so looking at this, promoted influence, yeah, interesting question. James, sometimes you have an interesting question that I really don't know the answer to, but it's going to be a pleasure to review with y'all. Again, remember, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, starting on May the 4th. And May the 4th this year, ladies and gentlemen, is on a Monday. So I'll see y'all on Monday, May 4th, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, to begin our APUSH review webinars on U.S. history, starting with colonial America. It is always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.